Greetings friends and welcome to the Essentials module. Essentials are skills that photographers use all the time. We will be covering these topics extensively throughout this course, so I want to talk about them up front. In this lesson, we're going to learn all about color, saturation, and sharpening. These can get a little bit dangerous if you don't know how to handle them correctly. So let's jump right in. All right, friends, welcome back to another Essentials lesson. In this episode, we will be talking about two very important techniques, color saturation and sharpening. So let's jump right into Lightroom first. All right, now for this lesson, I do want to take us all the way through the entire digital workflow. We will, of course, be concentrating on color saturation and sharpening, but again, I think it is important for us to see the entire workflow from start to finish. Naturally, for me, this begins in Lightroom, where we now have a series of raw files that were captured on location. Let's take a look at what we're working with here. Over on the left-hand side, I have what is obviously a bracketed series of images. So we start with number 1, and it's obviously quite dark. Number 2 is a little bit brighter. Number 3, we have kind of a middle exposure. 4, things get a little bit brighter, and off to number 5, things are almost pretty much overexposed at this point. Now, we will of course talk a lot about bracketing in future episodes. It's one of the most important techniques that you can do as a landscape photographer. But for right now, let's stay focused on color saturation and sharpening. So what I want to do is I want to pick the absolute best out of all 5 of these images. So let's just double click on our first one and get a look at these up a little bit closer. Now this image is quite a bit underexposed, so I don't think this is going to be our winner. If we move over to the right, things get just a little bit brighter, but it's still a little bit too dark for my flavor. So moving right along, here we hit our middle exposure, and this to me is looking like things are really starting to balance out nicely. So I'm going to remember that one for now. As I move to the right, things get a little bit too bright, and all the way at the top of my bracketed series, things are definitely overexposed. So let's move back to, let's look at the middle exposure, and I'm going to hit the B key on the keyboard. We're going to send this image to the quick collection, and we're going to look at this image all by itself. All right, so of our 5 bracketed frames, we determined that the middle exposure is going to be the best one. Now we have this beautiful little pine tree that is isolated in the midst of this aspen forest, and the thing for me that makes this image unique is that all of the aspen trees are leaning in uniform in the same direction, creating these beautiful diagonal lines, whereas the evergreen trees are quite obviously growing straight up and down. So this is a bit of a unique situation. You don't often see this in nature. We just happened to get lucky on our last expedition and stumble across this beautiful little scene in the middle of the forest. All right, I'm going to take us through a very quick development process here. If there are certain tools that we use that are unfamiliar to you, do not worry, we will definitely circle back into the development module many times over in this tutorial. Again, I want to focus on color saturation and sharpness. So in order for us to do that, let me just kind of race through a couple of development items that will get this image up and running where we need it to be. Step 1. When we are working with aspen trees, I typically like to go into my white balance color picker. Now what's happening right now throughout the scene is that there is an enormous amount of yellow leaves all around, and those yellow leaves are therefore bouncing a great deal of yellow ambient light all throughout our forest. And when we have lots of yellow light bouncing around our forest, we have yellow aspen trunks. I want my aspen trunks to be white, not yellow. So Lightroom has a very powerful white balance tool that allows me to select an area in the image that should be a neutral white or gray, and Lightroom will automatically make adjustments to my color temperature based on that value. So let's click right about here, and voila, as you can see, all of my aspen trunks just became a vibrant white. They are no longer yellow. So that is a good start. Let's move back over into our development module. I'm basically going to crank through a couple of adjustments really quickly to get this image up and running. Let's start with exposure. I want to bring this up a couple of points. That looks pretty good. We'll bring our highlights down just a tiny little bit. Shadows can come up just a tiny little bit. Blacks can come up just a tiny little bit, and whites can also come up just a little bit. Now let's move down into vibrance and saturation. This is going to be one of the focal points of this particular Essentials lesson. One of the biggest pitfalls that I see new photographers run into is they immediately start cranking the vibrance and color saturation parameters all the way through the roof. Now this may look like a fun effect, and you've probably seen lots and lots of images on Instagram and Facebook that are just completely blown out the roof on color saturation, but I promise you this is not the path that you want to go down. Color saturation should not be abused. It's really easy to start cranking those sliders all the way over to the right, but I promise you, if you are looking to create a professional workflow in your photography, please avoid oversaturating your images. So for now, I'm just going to dial these back to a very modest 8 points on vibrance and 8 points on color saturation. Now that may not seem like a lot, but trust me, this image already has an enormous amount of color saturation in it to begin with. Even though we started off with a flat gray raw file, your color saturation can very quickly get out of hand. All right, we'll circle back on color saturation in just another little bit. Let's do a few other refinements here. I'm gonna create a nice tone curve. Let's bring our highlights, in this case, up 8 points. Whites can go up about 5 points, darks can come down -5 points, and then shadows can come down about -6 points. Now, as we start to create things like tone curves and as we start to add things like contrast in our image, we will in fact more or less begin adding additional points of color saturation as well. For instance, if I were to ratchet up this tone curve and bring my darks down and my shadows down, as you can see, I've just by default automatically added a huge amount of color saturation. Even though I'm not actually working with color, I'm working with tonality here. So there are lots of different elements that can build up and create huge amounts of color saturation in your file. Even though you're not cranking up an actual saturation slider, you are in fact adding by default a little additional color saturation as you start to move your other contrast and tonality sliders around. So let's ease back on these. Again, let's go up 8, 5, -5, -8. And there we go. That brings our image back down towards reality. All right, while we're on the subject of color, let's go down into our hue, saturation, and luminance area. Right now, what I want to do is I want to create a little bit of separation between all of these beautiful green leaves and all of the beautiful yellow leaves in the scene. As you may or may not know, digital camera sensors tend to pack a bunch of actual yellow color matrix into the greens that we see in our image. And as such, our greens actually have quite a bit of yellow in them. And that's why the greens and yellow in this image are kind of starting to blur together. Let's move this green tab all the way over and I'll give you an example. Right now, I have basically told the greens to more or less separate themselves from the yellows. And as a result, we get all of these electric lime green branches in our scene. Now, I do love that there is a lot of green represented in this fall color image. I think we got really lucky in the fact that half of the trees were at peak color and half of the trees were still in the midst of changing. This gives us a huge amount of variety in our colors. But once again, we have gone into a hyper color situation by dragging this slider all the way off to the right. So I want to separate my greens from my yellows with subtlety, not electric power. We're going to go up into our yellows and we're going to move them off to the right just a little bit as well. And as you can see, there is an enormous amount of yellow in the green matrix. So let's ease back on that as well. Let's come over for both of these at about somewhere in the realm of 20 to 25%. All right, now even with just these few amounts of edits, I'm starting to see an enormous amount of color saturation happening in this image. So let's roll back up now that we have already created lots of other edits, and let's dial back on our vibrance and our color. It's not gonna hurt us a little bit. Let's go to level 4 and 4 points there. That's gonna take it just a little bit easier so that we are not, again, creating some hyper electric, colorful nonsense. All right, one last quick little thing that I would do to this image. I would grab a graduated neutral density filter, come up here to this corner, which is looking a little bit overexposed, and then we kind of bring this guy down in this realm just a little bit. We'll ease back on our highlights, and we'll ease back on our exposure. That brings that corner down just a little bit, gives it kind of a nice vignette, and it helps to match the color density and the tonality density in the top left with that which is happening down in the top right. All right, let's close this up. One last thing that I want to do, again, while we're on the subject of color, let's look at color saturation. Now the color saturation tab down in our HSL luminance panel gives us the opportunity to target specific colors and control how much color saturation they have. Again, this image is absolutely loaded with yellow. So if I grab my yellow tab and I drag it all the way down, I get a mostly black and white image. This is pretty cool because it means that I can target specific colors and control them without affecting other colors. Again, let's go back to 0 right here, and I feel like there is just an enormous amount of yellow happening, so let's ease back. Let's come back about, call it 6 points. We don't want to subtract all of the color. It's okay to have a slightly oversaturated image coming out of Lightroom because we can always subtract a little bit of color once we move into Photoshop for our fine tuning. All right, as we roll back up to the top of our development module, I feel like this image is pretty good straight out of Lightroom. So we are now going to export this image and do some fine tuning in Photoshop. And now that we've addressed the color saturation situation, we now need to talk about sharpening. Sharpening is another pitfall that new photographers tend to get themselves into, and you don't want to over sharpen your image. So after we export into Photoshop, let's just load our file, which I have already added over into Photoshop. And let's take a look at some basic sharpening techniques. There is so much going on in this image. Again, it is a very beautiful image, and I don't think you're going to see this very often in nature, but we do need to use caution in how we handle this image. We have done our absolute best to resist the color saturation slider and turn this into an obnoxious Instagram filter. Now we need to be equally vigilant and resist the temptation to over sharpen this image. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my background layer, double click, and I'm going to rename this Original. Anytime that you're editing something in Photoshop, you never want to edit the original. So in order to add sharpening to this image, I'm basically just going to duplicate this whole image by holding Command J. This gives me an exact copy of my image. And I'm going to call this Sharp. So this is the layer that we will use to effect our sharpening filters upon without ever touching the original. All right, let's zoom in a little bit. Let's go to full size so we can see what's happening up here. This is a very beautiful image. It was shot with a 300mm lens at approximately 135mm. So we do have really good sharpness happening right down the center of the image where the focal point was adjusted. As you can see off here in the distance, many of the leaves in the forest behind our focal point are starting to fall out of focus. And it would be really weird for us to sharpen these areas that are out of focus. That's how you get pictures that look fake and artificial and, again, amateur hour. So let's go up into our basic sharpening tool, and I'm going to go into our filters, come down to sharpen, and we're going to use unsharp mask. Now, I know that Photoshop does have lots and lots of new smart sharpening capabilities. I personally never really dabble in with those all that much because I have always had such incredibly good results from the good old-fashioned unsharp mask. This filter has been around a long time. It does an excellent job at what it does best, and this is how we're going to use it today. Now, I have been using the same parameters in this filter for many years. Amount 106%, radius of 3.4 pixels, and a threshold level of 4. I dialed these settings in years ago and I never really looked back because they've always been very effective for everything that I've ever needed to do. This includes landscapes and portraits. So if you want to take a screenshot of this or if you want to write these numbers down, I can promise you they will always work for just about every situation that you want to sharpen your image. So let's click OK. And as you can see, Photoshop has sharpened this entire layer. I have huge amounts of sharpening going on all over the place. And so what the unsharp mask does is it looks for areas of high contrast in your image and it essentially increases that contrast. So anywhere that we have these dark black nodules coming up on our aspen trees, they are now extremely contrasty against the white bark. The same is true of all of our little pine cone bristles here and all of these branches that are snaking their way through the scene. Now, what we've effectively done here is we have over sharpened this file. This is way too much sharpening. And when you over sharpen an image, it again tends to look pretty fake and pretty artificial. As a matter of fact, you should really only use very minimal sharpening in your post-production workflow because modern camera lenses these days, if you bought a camera within the last 5 years or even 10 years, modern camera lenses are incredibly sharp, especially when you spend the money to get a really good one. Now, cheaper lenses, maybe not so much, but all the same, even a modern cheap lens is probably quite a bit sharper than a really old lens. So for now, let's just work on the basis that we did our due diligence, that we shot at an appropriate f number, and that we do have, in fact, at least a moderately sharp lens. So what we have here is an over-sharpened situation. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm only sharpening areas that need to be sharpened, and that I'm not sharpening areas that should not be sharpened. The easiest way for us to do this is to use a layer mask. So I'm going to go over to my layers palette, down at the bottom. I'm going to activate the mask tool. I'm going to hold down the option key and I'm going to click the mask tool. Basically what this does is it creates a black mask on top of our sharpening layer. So essentially what's just happened here is my sharpening layer has now been hidden by the mask. This enables me to come in with a brush tool and paint in my sharpening in areas where I want it to occur. So let's go and grab a brush tool right here, and let's use white paint. I'm going to come in at about 30%. I'm going to increase the size of my brush using the right bracket key, and I'm basically just going to brush this sharpening in at only the locations that I feel like it is really necessary. So we're right here in the middle. I'm going to brush down my nice little evergreen tree right here, and I'm going to brush a little bit through this sort of central aspen leaves right through here. That looks good. I also want to make sure that I brush a couple of my primary aspen trees. Let's get them nice and sharp. Come down through here, brush a little bit. Let's make the brush roughly the size of this aspen tree and kind of brush through here, because I want to make sure that I'm not brushing into the back of the forest where things are naturally falling out of focus. So do not brush right here. Instead, only brush the aspen trees themselves, because they are in the proper focal plane that was in focus. Everything that goes out in behind them is going out of focus, because this was in fact a telephoto lens, and it has a relatively shallow depth of field, even at f11. So let's brush again down through here. Let's make sure that my aspen trees themselves are nice and sharp. Brush these guys in. And basically, as I kind of work my way closer to the peripheral, or dare I say the perimeter, the border of the image, I don't need to have razor sharpness up in that corner or down in that corner. As a matter of fact, down in this corner, you can see where there are some trees closer to the camera in the foreground. They are very out of focus at 135 millimeters. So I definitely do not want to brush any sharpness into that zone. So again, carefully, we're just going to brush a little bit of sharpness into areas where I only want it to be. Now let's go over here and look at our layer mask. You can see where I have brushed streaks of white paint into my layer mask, thus revealing the areas that I want in this image to be sharp. Let's go ahead and zoom back in. We'll go to 100% and we'll take a closer look at this image, and I will toggle this sharpness layer on and off. So here the sharpness layer is on, and here it is off. You can definitely see a distinct difference in the little evergreen tree right down the center. So sharpness on, we get a little bit more contrast, a little bit more kind of detail variety showing up in this tree. And then again, also in the aspen trees themselves, those are very nice. A couple of clusters of branches here, some of these leaves over here. All of those items deserve to be sharp. But again, sharpness off, it's a very, very subtle change, and sharpness on. So we are at this point not reaching the point where we have created an artificial sharpness that's going to make our image look fake. Again, please use extreme caution when over sharpening your image. If you follow these techniques, your image will always be nice and razor sharp, but not artificially sharp. I'm even going to dial back on this sharpness layer just a little bit. I don't think it needs to be at completely 100%. So let's bring it down to about 85%. So that which we have actually painted and masked into our scene is only going to be 85%. So we have in fact increased the sharpness with subtlety and not increased the sharpness with obnoxious artificiality, if that's such a word. In any regard, as we look at this image, again, Mother Nature has created a very, very beautiful scene for us to work with. It's our job to enhance this scene, but not to overtake this scene and create something that's completely fake. Because the viewer is going to know. They're going to say, oh wow, that's super fake. Let's take a look at what super fake looks like. I'm going to grab an adjustment layer here. And again, since we're talking about saturation, let's just juice up the saturation to an electric level. Now, nothing in reality looks like that. Not even the neon lights in Las Vegas. This is just absurd. So please, again, use caution when attempting to oversaturate your image. A lot of people oversaturate their images just because they want to get attention or because they want it to look bright and shiny on an iPhone. Trust me, that's not the way to go. If you want to have a professional quality to your images, leave the sharpening and the saturation at a minimum. Let's close this. Let's eliminate this ridiculous level of saturation. And as you can see, even now, the image just in its more or less natural state has an enormous amount of color already. We don't need to add more. All right, so that's just a quick lesson in using restraint when it comes to the things that I see new photographers doing all the time. It's very easy to get carried away with those color sliders. It's very easy to get carried away with the sharpening. So please be subtle, have a subtle hand in your edits. It will always serve you in the long run. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Again, we will be using these techniques throughout the course, so I hope you had fun here, and we'll see you in the next lesson.